On this week's Carrier Wrap, we talk with Alion Science Technology about the delicate balance between commercial and government use of cellular spectrum.
Today's episode is brought to you by Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board, telecomcareers.net.
Well, hello and welcome to this week's Carrier Wrap. I'm your host, Dan Meyer. I'm editor-in-chief here at RCR Wireless News. And today we are joined by Karl Nebbia, who's the Director of Spectrum Policy at Alion Science Technology, to talk about the general spectrum environment when it comes to the commercial carriers. I mean, obviously, spectrum is a lifeblood of the industry. Auctions have been in the past year recently and one coming up again. But it is becoming more difficult when it comes to freeing up spectrum for commercial use. And we're going to talk with Karl a bit about what's happening, I guess, in the space in terms of freeing up spectrum perhaps from government use or even shared usage with the government on this. So Karl, thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Well, maybe start off with, I want to get a little overview of the company, perhaps a little background on yourself as well. I know you've been working in the government for a while yourself, so maybe some background on yourself and the company too.
Okay, real quick. Alion Science and Technology is a company that specializes in technology solutions for current issues, both domestic issues and international issues. The company's origins actually go back about 75 years to an organization called the Illinois Institute of Technology Research Institute, ITRI. And that organization began doing spectrum work probably during the 60s. In 2002, the employees of the company actually bought the company, and retitled it Alion Science and Technology. And since that time, we've been expanding into a number of different areas dealing with human factors, naval architecture, a variety of different things. We still have about 125 people here, though, that are spectrum specialists, that's what they do all the time. And that's out of somewhere over 2,500 total employees in the company. So things are kind of spread around company-wide, but the spectrum people are in primarily the DC, Baltimore area. Mm-hmm. And I've been with them for a year now, having spent 30 years in the federal government, over 30 years. Most of it with NTIA. I ended up at NTIA as the Associate Administrator of the Office of Spectrum Management, and therefore the one who was managing federal government use of the radio spectrum. And we were in the middle of various efforts to free up spectrum, working with the White House on issues related to how we make more spectrum available for the wireless carriers and so on. One of the interesting things is since 1979, I came out of the Marine Corps as an artillery officer. I actually went to work for IIT Research back in those days. So this is somewhat of a homecoming for me. And it's been great being back here, seeing the company moving on. And it's just exciting to be in the spectrum world because so much is happening there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously in the commercial space, like we saw an auction this past year that generated a significant amount of money, more than $40 billion. So obviously it seems like on the commercial side of things, at least, operators are very hungry for spectrum. And again, with AWS ban, a lot of that was kind of I guess carved out of some government usage. So it does seem like that's kind of the wave going forward too. I mean, I know the auction coming up is more of a television ban type of thing, but it seems like beyond that, it gets more and more difficult to find spectrum. So I guess what's maybe your general view of kind of how the government has done so far in I guess balancing that need to kind of get more spectrum for the commercial side of things, but also obviously the government needs spectrum as well, and maybe some better usage there. But I guess what's your general view of kind of how the government has done recently and kind of freeing up and kind of balancing that need between commercial and government side of spectrum usage?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government's done a terrific job in putting bans on the table. They've looked at a whole range of frequencies in terms of what might be able to be done quickly, what was going to take more time. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that government programs, it's not like cell phones that are coming out with a new cell phone every year. They're coming out with new offerings of services and so on. And you may have new carriers offering services in your area at one point, and then they're not there the next year and so on. The programs that the government operates under, work under long-term funding efforts, identification of requirements for the future, and so on. So it's like a large ship, not easy to turn and go in a new direction, but sometimes, certainly when there's money available to make that turn, the government can do some new things. But ultimately, on the Spectrum side, we always have to recognize that the Spectrum people are trying to meet the mission needs that have been assigned to their agencies. And that mission need is not, of course, making money off of Spectrum use. It's something completely different than that. So the Spectrum people are always support people, viewed by those who have to accomplish the mission as a, kind of a necessity, but not something, that they would rather just be guaranteed that they can do their mission in whatever way they choose to do it. And in fact, ultimately, you've got to get in this Spectrum mix. So I think the NTIA, working with the federal agencies through what's called the Policy and Plan Steering Group at NTIA, which is a group of agencies meeting together, but it includes the FCC at senior levels. It includes the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, national security advisors, and so on, in a way that we never had with Spectrum on the government side when it was limited to what was called the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, which was essentially all the groups of Spectrum users and senior Spectrum managers, as opposed to getting up into the executive and political world. So the PPSG offers something new, and I think NTIA has been using that to its best advantage. We've identified, or they identified while I was there, some significant pieces of Spectrum, and certainly with the AWS-3 auction, we not only saw how much the Spectrum was worth, but also how a cooperative environment could help make that opportunity. And in this case, we had a lot of interaction between the government and industry through the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee leading up to this auction. A lot of analysis went on. And I have to say that Alion Science was directly in the middle of that, supporting the Defense Department on the discussions. But ultimately, I think creating a role that we're going to see more of in the future, and that is for technical, honest brokers who can bring people together, offer new possibilities, breaking out of maybe some of the old approaches where we're generally dealing with worst case analysis and not looking at probabilistic types of approaches and those sorts of things. So we're seeing people that can offer these kinds of technology skills, opening doors, bringing people together, and I think that's a great thing. Alion continued in that process after we had the initial CSMAC work done. Alion put together what was called the DoD workbook, which was a first-time idea of giving to the potential Spectrum bidders information on the uses in particular areas and how long was going to be it would take the government to vacate those specific geographic areas, giving much more granularity to the information that the bidders were going to have. During AWS-1, and I was there through that whole iteration, It was interesting because when an agency said, we will be out in 3 years or in 5 years, they were essentially expecting that nobody was going to call them for 3 or 5 years, that they were going to get out in that time. They were going to vacate the Spectrum, and then the companies could move in. But what happened in reality is starting on day one, companies started calling and saying, can we come this far? Can we get this close? Can we turn on this channel? And so on. So in this case, DoD being able to offer that information, I think really helped the companies understand what they were looking at. Anytime when you're in a bidding environment and you have more information, of course, the bids tend to be stronger. And then ultimately, Alion has continued in the DoD process to help provide the mechanisms for the portal whereby the incoming companies are going to be coordinating through and interacting with that portal to know when they can turn on, various systems or base stations and so on. So it's been great playing a really key role here and seeing Alion play that role. And from both perspectives, because I was on the government side initially and have seen them, continue to work through this process. So it's great to see that happen. And I know we're trying to promote that continued dialogue to see if there are spectrum opportunities for the future.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to talk too much right now until the next auction's over, but that's the nature of the business. So.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get to that part later. But I mean, obviously, it makes sense to look back a bit, because the AWS proceedings, I mean, those went back to late 90s, really. I mean, there was some work started. I know we were covering here at RCR for years and years, and there was talk about, freeing up the Spectrum and how it'd have to be working with the DoD on this. And it was a long process towards the AWS 1 auction, which was 2006, I believe. And even that's
right.
And that was, that generated almost $14 billion. And that was a successful auction. But it really seemed to kind of lay the groundwork, though, that showed that there could be this cooperation. And obviously, there was, several years afterwards where it took some time for the Spectrum to be freed up. But for myself, I know just talking to the operators who won Spectrum in the AWS 1 auction, they seemed to be very happy with how that went. I mean, they seemed very, they knew it was going to take a few years, but I think at the end of it, they seemed content with how the process went through. The Spectrum was freed up. They were able to use the Spectrum pretty rapidly. I know some of the operators were a little more aggressive. I think they're the ones who were calling you probably on day one, asking when they can get in there. But it did seem like they were able to kind of work through the process pretty well, and that seemed to really set the groundwork for AWS 3, which obviously from a financial point of view was a big success for the government at least. But there was 15 years of work that really led up to kind of where we got to this past year.
Yeah, I think the interesting part of that is that the beginnings of that actually started in like 1992 when Congress first indicated that they wanted Spectrum from the government turned over, and the AWS 1 band, actually I think a little bit larger band, was actually identified during that time. But the critical point was the ability to make it happen really didn't come about until Congress agreed on the Spectrum Relocation Fund mechanism. The Spectrum, the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, I think was the first name. And that mechanism for reimbursing the federal agencies was critical to forward movement. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think that is probably the significant issue that held up the movement. In fact, there's other legislation that has essentially said that the Defense Department needed to be compensated for being moved and needed to be ensured that they could find comparable operating capabilities in other spectrum or something along those lines. So that ability to make the move really didn't happen until the CSEA was passed. That facilitated AWS 1. There were still some hiccups along the way. There were certain assumptions in that law, at least as interpreted, I think, by OMB, that the agencies, other than moving, the agencies couldn't really benefit. They couldn't move to a newer technology, that sort of thing. And yet what we found is in times we were trying to replace technology that was already 15 or 20 years old, and something of the same model or scale didn't exist in other bands. So it was really clear that at least in some areas, it was impossible to not have some upgrading of the government capability. It just had to happen. So in the update to the CSEA, Congress did make it clear that that type of logical upgrading was possible, that you didn't have to just say, if I have a 30-year-old analog radio, then the only thing I can do is buy a new 30-year-old analog radio in another band. That wasn't the case. So the new CSEA updated that and made it more possible to move forward. And I think in this case, we not only had that enabling spectrum sharing as an outcome, which I think was critical, but also just the process became clear, what people were doing, what was the expectation, and everybody worked together. So hopefully we'll see even further improvements in that as we go forward. And I know there's lots of attempts going on or looks at new legislation, which will probably be aimed at improving the situation even further.
Sure, sure. And honestly, it does seem like that equipment aspect of it is a big part because, like you said, I mean, there was a lot of equipment out there used by the government that was 20, 30 years old, very, analog, not very efficient perhaps. And that was kind of, I know from the commercial side of things, there's always this argument that, the government is not being very efficient in its use of spectrum. They could easily free up some if they become more, use more modern technologies. I went to a lot of conferences myself, and that was a big argument by a lot of people. But again, you're dealing with the DoD, for instance. I mean, their job is not necessarily be the most efficient use of spectrum users. Their job is to protect the country, or whatever we need to do. And so it was always seemed like there was like this mindset or this kind of clash of what the real use of the spectrum was for. And people were on the commercial side just saying, hey, give us a spectrum. We know we can use it better, but there's also the national security issue that can't be overlooked. I know, with FirstNet, for instance, that's been an ongoing issue about government being more efficient with spectrum usage as well. So it does seem that's been perhaps an ongoing part of this, just making the government, aware that, maybe new technologies can be used that are more efficient or perhaps as robust as what's been used in the past as well.
Right, but I think once again, there you get into this question of how is the government different from commercial industry?
Yeah.
If industry finds that they can cut their bandwidth in half and get a whole lot more users on the same system, then obviously they're going to make that choice when they see that it brings in increased revenue and so on. On the government side, in almost every case where we're dealing with a government-oriented mission technology, you will find that the government is actually using the current technology. Mm-hmm. It's just that some of that technology itself, from a generic standpoint, has grown old. But for instance, if we're doing law enforcement surveillance, the Department of Justice, while it may be using very wideband technology, at least in the past years, mm-hmm. it was using the most up-to-date law enforcement surveillance equipment that was available. Mm-hmm. So there was nothing available in smaller bandwidths. And of course, as long as the existing technology was enabling an FBI agent to go into a dangerous place and have something that they were wearing that was completely invisible to the bad guys, they didn't care about new technology.
True.
But when you tell them, okay, well, we can get you a digital signal now, and all they care about is, well, are you going to get the digital signal, or are there going to be interruptions to it, and that sort of thing. And then when you say, and also the digital signal, we're going to be packaging in such a way that we've got a new battery in there, we've got new capabilities and so on. But in our first test, the only problem is the batteries overheat, and you may start smoking during a very difficult situation. So anyway, the government actually, the one place where there is very clear comparison between the government and the non-federal government is in public safety equipment. And certainly on the federal side, they've been using as narrowband a mobile radio as the state and locals and so on have been doing. In fact, they've been out ahead of that. But there's just nobody else that offers this type of law enforcement surveillance equipment. Nobody else is doing FAA air traffic control monitoring. Nobody else is doing DoD work. So once again, they're out to complete a mission until there's a reason that benefits them to move on to new technology. And it's usually the mission that drives it, not man, if we could just reduce our spectrum use, it would make everybody feel better. That's not, certainly the guy in the field, that's not important. But the folks in DC that run the spectrum offices are becoming much more in tune to that. They understand the president's goals, and they're working diligently to make that happen. And I think ultimately what they see is that a merging of the commercial world and the government world to a point where they can operate in the same pieces of spectrum are to both of their benefits. It makes more spectrum available to everybody, and it enables DoD to get spectrum in certain bands that they need to have access to. I mean, certainly when they're in a difficult place overseas, mm-hmm. they need to know what's going on in the commercial wireless bands, or they need to be able to function there themselves. So we've got to be able to practice on it here at home. We need to be able to do that. So I think we're seeing a lot of that cross-pollination coming down. But most of it is really driven by the fact that we've got to share spectrum. There's just you can't just keep moving some people out. And the technologies are just not easily transferable up the spectrum scale.
Yeah.
DoD and federal agencies, they want mobility also.
Yeah.
Let's face it, high-performance aircraft requires a whole lot more mobility than I'll ever need driving my car down the road trying to make a cell phone connection. So it's a different world, and I think they need to cooperate together. So.
Yeah, and like you said too, it does seem like at least the financial aspect of it, these auctions generating so much money and having some money set aside specifically for updating the equipment for the federal government. That seems like that's definitely helped, I guess, grease the wheels or whatever you want to say. I mean, it's kind of helped the process along because, again, always finances is always a difficult situation when it comes to Washington and politics and the budget and stuff. So it does seem like being able to at least have that money set aside, a certain amount of money set aside, seems to be helping the process. And obviously with the last auction we just had, I'm guessing that shows to the government that, and to the government Spectrum users currently that, yeah, I mean, there's probably going to be enough money set aside to make all this work. If you need to buy some new equipment, there'll be money available to make that part happen.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge there, of course, is being able to apply monies as a way of priming the pump, as opposed to only paying for an outcome ultimately. And for instance, if we're going to develop new spectrum efficient technologies for the government that allow either more government users in the same spectrum space or sharing with the non-federal users, that technology has to be developed, and it needs to be developed at such a time that we are assured when we're making the spectrum decisions about relocation of the government that the technology's there, not that we're going to find out afterward whether it works or not. They need to know whether it works. So I think for the first time actually in the recent budget agreement, there was money set aside up front, allowing agencies to begin to draw on some of that money for new development of spectrum sharing type technologies and spectrum improving spectrum efficiency and so on. So I think we're now beginning to see the tide turn to recognize, you got to prime the pump here, not just pay for what you've already decided to do. So I think that's going to be an important part of the future, because as the agencies get to look at, okay, how do we move the ball forward? They now understand that the money to make it happen ultimately will be through the Spectrum Relocation Fund arrangement, but the money to identify whether they can do it needs to be there up front. And I think that's a critical piece of what they're looking at.
Oh, I mean, so I guess maybe looking ahead a little bit. I mean, does it seem like then that this process is getting easier? I mean, obviously, with the government stepping in a little bit more to kind of ensure that money will be there. From your point of view, does it seem like that the process should, at least the process part of it, should be easier? I mean, obviously, locating spectrum that can be freed up is going to be more and more challenging as we go along. But I guess as the initial process of it, it's getting to be an easier process, I guess, for everybody to be on board with and to understand what's going to be part of how this all works out.
Yeah, I think the process is getting more workable, and I think they'll continue to improve that. Of course, people often say at the same time that we have actually been picking at the low-hanging fruit, and now we're moving on to the bigger challenges. And of course, most of those bigger challenges involve a lot of government radar uses. So in the 1300 megahertz band, we've got FAA and DoD long-range air surveillance radars, things that allow aircraft to fly all the way across the country. And as you move up to 2.7 gigahertz, it's air traffic control around every airport in the country, plus all the weather radars where you're following on your local TV station what the weather in your area. It's all generated from government systems operate in that band. You start going up higher and you start getting into really heavy-duty tactical military systems on ships and aircraft and so on. And they're all vital. But the reality is that they use spectrum on an intermittent basis, but they still have to do it. When it comes time to turn the system on, they have to be able to do that.
Yeah, and that seems like the biggest challenge for operators because I know, I mean, always the priority access issue has been a big part of, I know past, obviously with the first step at the D block spectrum, that seemed to have kind of scared away perhaps maybe some operators initially on bidding on that was because there didn't seem to be quite concrete rules, or perhaps the priority access part of it was a bit of they weren't sure how that was going to work out in the real world. But like you said, though, that seems like that's going to be a significant part of this going forward because, if there are these huge swaths of spectrum that can be used at least on maybe a majority basis for the commercial side and a minority basis for the government side, but the commercial guys have to be comfortable with what the rules are, and obviously the people giving up the spectrum need to be comfortable with it as well. So it seems like the technology aspect of that sharing is a big part of this. And do you think we are to a point now where the technology does allow for both sides to at least be somewhat happy with what the outcome could potentially be with sharing those spectrum bands?
Well, certainly if everybody's willing to be flexible, I think it's workable. I mean, now we've proven some of the capability using what's called dynamic frequency selection up in the 5 gigahertz range, where the newest generation of Wi-Fi essentially incorporated the capability of sensing government radars in the area and switching channels in their selection of which channel the device was going to use. Selecting a new channel based on having seen that radar signal and having moved off the channel where the radar is. So in essence, they're free to use that spectrum all the time until a radar shows up, and then they've got to be able to respond to that signal and move quickly, because some of the radar systems we're talking about may have to come up online and operate very quickly, picking up, and certainly in a military environment, incoming, enemy targets and so on, that sort of thing. So it's important that they function properly. And I think in that case, what we found is that industry was very capable of building equipment that could, in fact, do what we needed to do. We also found out that, savvy IT-oriented people could figure out how to turn off the dynamic frequency selection and make their Wi-Fi operate faster. So what we found was people going through the software choices and switching off that capability. They probably read it in a tech magazine somewhere. If you click no here, it gets a whole lot faster. That kind of thing. So what we found was we were having some of the wireless internet service providers using that band, and they were interfering with FAA wind shear radars at various airports around the country because the systems were not recognizing the presence of the radar and they were not shifting off the channel. So it's an interesting, that situation has grown, or you've been in the process over the last 10 years. I think the initial decisions on that started at the World Radio Conference in 2003. And I think we've made a lot of progress there. But future generations of Wi-Fi are looking for more access. And what we're seeing now is not only do they have to deal with radar operations, they may have to deal with satellite operations and a variety of different things they have to see. So it's going to be interesting. I think the technology capabilities are there, but everybody's got to be flexible. And I think ultimately, as opposed to each group having their own piece of spectrum, everybody needs to see it as a whole. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, fits well for the unlicensed community. It's not an idea that has traditionally been what the licensed world has looked at. They're dealing with that, of course, in the FCC's ramp up to the 3550 and 3650 completion of that rulemaking. Once again, Alion is involved in that, mostly doing analysis and measurement work, helping DoD through their questions. Are the systems capable of protecting the government radar systems? But the licensed and unlicensed communities, of course, are arguing through their issues and who's got what rights and how are we going to enforce those rights and how much spectrum may be dedicated for either part and that sort of thing. So a lot going on, really. Yeah.
Well, I guess maybe looking forward a bit on this. And I mean, you kind of already mentioned some spectrum bands that perhaps could be at some point down the road, part of this sharing initiative, whether it's 1.3 or up to 2.7 or whatever it could be. I mean, I guess as you look ahead, is there enough spectrum out there over the next 4 years? I mean, I know the president came in 2010 and, wanted to have 500 megahertz of spectrum freed up within 10 years. And, we've made some pretty good progress towards that. Is there enough spectrum out there to fulfill that wish? Or, even if it takes a few more years, is there enough, you think, out there for sharing abilities to kind of keep at least the commercial side, not necessarily happy, but at least able to continue to support customers, but while also being able to obviously support the federal government as well, because they don't want to give up, their capabilities as well. Is there enough, do you think, out there to kind of make all this work and at some point during the next 4 to 5, 6 years?
Well, I think the spectrum's there, even in the ranges that everybody's most interested in, below 4 gigahertz, let's say. The spectrum is there if people are willing to share it and come up with, reasonable approaches. For instance, in the AWS-3 band, one of the things that became clear is that it was impossible for the government to move the satellite command uplinks that they had at quite a number of locations around the country. But in the end, the industry said, look, with our new LTE technology, we're not really worried about it. We're going to be able to operate around you. We'll be selecting, what frequencies are open at any particular time. We've got, multiple bands to access and so on. So, it was industry that came forward and said, don't worry about us on this. We understand your satellite systems have to stay. We'll come up with a solution and we'll work around them. Now, the government wasn't necessarily, they didn't feel secure about that necessarily, because they were afraid that once the thing started heating up that people were going to call complaining and say, you really need these satellite systems out of here. The interference was all into the wireless industry, not into the satellite system. So, but, we've seen them work together and move forward there in these major radar bands. There's going to have to be, once again, a working together, among them. Certainly, as people are talking about 5G, it's clear that industry sees that if you're going to do really huge growth of bandwidth, it's going to have to be at higher frequencies. Yeah. There's going to have to be much more of a localized demand for it that gets met, and not down in some of the traditional, lower band.
Right.
So.
Definitely a lot of talk about the millimeter wave of 60 gigahertz, 80 gigahertz band, even above 20 gigahertz. Really, I know in the latest work, or at least FCC came out and was going to push a lot. Even above 27 gigahertz band, I think as well. They were looking at for getting some unity around the world on that too. So. A lot of work, and it seems like on that, but again, I mean, obviously this, again, the technology part of it, like you mentioned, I mean, I know at least in the unlicensed space, there's the arguments going on right now with being able to use, LTE and unlicensed bands and things too. So obviously on the technology side, a lot of work is being done. It does seem like you're trying to be able to share at least what's out there and not interfere so much. I mean, I know with Light Squared, for instance, their spectrum with the GPS community that's a whole other argument there, which could take another couple hours, but yeah, I mean, it does seem like there's a lot of tentativeness when it comes to sharing, because once you kind of give up some spectrum, it's hard to get that spectrum back at some point. So everybody's got to make sure that
even on the Light Squared side, I had the opportunity, if you want to call it that, the opportunity to testify before Congress while I was working at NTIA. But even on the Light Squared side, we're seeing some progress made, but it's coming through cooperation and working together. It's not coming through just lobbing, grand statements saying the other guy's the bad guy and we've got a good solution that they don't want, and that sort of thing. So I think it's that kind of collaboration, cooperation that's got to be the hallmark of the future. So.
Yeah, I mean, of course, in the media, we love seeing all those, arguments thrown back and forth. But obviously, at the end of the day, it does make sense for everybody to come together, just agree to some sort of way to make this work out. Because, again, just spectrum is sitting there not being used is the worst thing you could possibly have when there's so much demand for it. So you got to find a way to at least get it out there. Now, obviously, it sounds like you guys are kind of in the middle of that, making sure that people can kind of come together and agree on things. And it does seem like it's kind of building on itself too. I mean, the more agreements that there are, it is showing that people can work together, and that there are kind of templates out there that kind of show how this can all work out going forward. So it seems like the work it's progressing. It's kind of a snowball effect, really, at this point, to kind of keep it moving.
I mean, we're still a little bit from Woodstock. Let's it still is not quite a love fest, but I think we are working through difficult issues, and I think everybody sees in the long run we've got to work through those things together. And I think they're certainly on the government side that I'm most familiar with. I worked in for a long time. I see people over there who are willing and pushing to make that work. And I think that's just essential to the process, is having the leadership that's working that angle. Because obviously the people in the field, it's not in their interest to see something change. The same way, somebody came up to me and said, Karl, I'd like you to go tell your family that we want them to move somewhere else. And of course, when I went home, I'm sure my wife would say, well, what wonderful things are they going to give us for this? And I'd say, well, all they're promising is a comparable space somewhere else. It doesn't, you don't make people happy that way. So I think in the end, the government's got to come out of this in a way that obviously has to make appropriators happy, because there's nothing people on the appropriations side of government like less than a sense that the government's getting money that nobody has any real control over, that they're just out spending it on what they want. So all that has to work together, the political side too, and people are doing that. So.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I know you work more on the government side of things, between the government and commercial side, but I mean, obviously with the auction coming up this year with the 600 megahertz, which is more of a broadcast spectrum situation, do you see that as having any sort of impact, or a good or bad impact on kind of your work with working with the government and trying to free up spectrum as well? I mean, what impact do you see from perhaps that auction going off?
Well, I mean, certainly from the government side, one of the great things about it is it takes the heat a little bit off the government, because people are looking and saying, oh, we see here on the private sector, we have a hard time, getting everybody to talk together and work together too. But I think ultimately, I think the spectrum demand is there. I think obviously since we went through the digital conversion, people can see every day on their televisions when they look and see that each station has 4 sub-channels, something down that path, and they click through them and they see, well, I only see 2 channels filled here, and one of them is a weather broadcast and so on. Or, in some cases there are 2 or 3, but once again, one of them is a weather broadcast and one of them is Westerns or comedies from when I was a teenager. And they weren't that funny back then, so whether they're funny now, I don't know, but they are nostalgic. I'll admit that. But people look at those channels and say, well, why are these vacant? And ultimately, every broadcasting company has to look at the value of what they have and what they're actually using. But the easy part seems to me to be the part they're not using. And, being able, I'm impressed with the Commission's efforts to make this work, bringing together, people from both sides, conducting an auction with participation from both sides, where the participants can't actually talk to each other. There's, they lay out their bids on both sides, and then in between the bids, the Commission's going to shuffle the deck again. And come up with, okay, well, here's the new package, and things are going to look more clear as you go along. So it's a complex business, but I think with every auction the Commission's held over the years, there's always been a new spin to it, something new about it, and that's so they're always having to update how they handle the auction process, and this one is going to be particularly complicated.
Yeah. I mean, say what you will about your opinion on Wheeler, Commissioner Wheeler or not, or Chairman Wheeler. He definitely has put his all of his eggs into the Spectrum basket. I mean, he's definitely banked his whole legacy, I think, as FCC chairman on these auctions. And obviously, the first one went off pretty well, and this one here will be a big test for the FCC. I mean, I know they've got a lot of smart people working there, working with on the process. But like you said, it's going to be a huge challenge for those guys, and they have to take some pressure off the government. That's probably a good thing as well too. But at least I know with the FCC, they will be pretty stressed out, I'm sure, over the next 12 months or so as this process ramps up and actually starts playing out too. So I'm sure.
Well, having worked at NTIA all those years, we kind of love seeing the FCC stressed out a little. My friend Julie Knapp, it's always good to see him sweat a little bit over there and so on. But I think in this case, obviously the AWS-3 auction. took some capital out of the market. Has to, as a lot of money, but the demand is still there. I think the companies are going to benefit from the lower frequency to help cover all the gaps that exist across the country. So I think there is going to be a significant interest, and I think ultimately the question will be, if there isn't significant interest, what is that going to say? How is that going to impact the message that there is this heavy demand? And I think what we'll really see is that the demand is still there. The companies, in fact, will be really working to get this. Are we going to see a frenzy? I can't say, or an extravaganza, as the chairman termed it. So that I really can't say. But I think ultimately we're dealing with what in many cases is completely unused spectrum.
Yeah.
Whereas the government, you can often say, well, their use is light, it's intermittent, it's here and there whenever they need it. But these are cases where there's portions of this spectrum that are essentially permanently unused.
Yeah.
And I do think that, if you have a resource like that somebody's willing to pay you money for, I would think the broadcasters are going to take that in some cases. In other cases, they'll have to evaluate, is this worth it or not, depending on how the market's going and so on. But we're certainly seeing, a great shift over time, more and more people accessing television broadcasting through the internet over wireless and so on. So it's really, certainly changed the environment.
Definitely. That sounds good. Well, hey, Karl, this is a topic we could talk on for another couple hours. I don't want to take up your whole day there, but I definitely appreciate the great insight on this. I mean, I know, again, like you said, it's a topic that hopefully we can kind of cover again at some point as well, but definitely appreciate the great insight on this, and thanks so much for the information and the time today. We appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us in this week's Carrier Wrap, and make sure to check us out again next week. Thanks for watching.